Welcome back, everyone. As you see per the title, today we're going to be watching Cliffe and Stuart Knechtle, the Christians, debating Alex O'Connor and Phil, who are the atheists in this debate. Let's get into it.
Gentlemen, the floor is all yours for open dialogue.
All right, I'll start. First of all, Phil, I don't know where he's getting his philosophy of religion and his statistics, but just to keep him honest for a second, check out Nature magazine, a highly secular, atheistic journal magazine, I would call it, over here. And over 40% of Harvard med school professors and Harvard philosophers at large, teachers, say that there is a personal, biblical God. Over 40% are then agnostic and say that they are not sure. So the highest level of thinking, at least here in the U.S., Oxford and Cambridge could be higher, but I'm dubious. And they outright say, the majority say that there is a biblical God that exists. A very small percentage are atheists. They're atheists. Maybe that's largely because they're scared, because so many people think that they're snobbish and they're arrogant, atheists, that is. But I believe it's based off of evidence that all these Harvard professors at Harvard Med and undergrad have come to. So that's Nature magazine. That's not Christianity Today. It's no Christian magazine or type of literature. That's your literature, my friend. So that's where I would start. And secondly, why then is almost 70% of atheists white male? Why are all the largest conferences held around the world always white male? Usually only one country presented, and that's your country. Bring somebody along who is white. All the others are white as well. Usually one of different ethnicity is represented. So talk about a construct. David Hume had an incredible influence here when it came to the miraculous and denying the miraculous. I think he's an idiot. But talk about a construct. Talk about those who, if Alex is going to make the point of the genetic fallacy point, if he's just going to say, whether it's in Myanmar or the U.S., just because someone has greater exposure to the biblical God doesn't mean they have somehow a better chance at accepting him. I have a 75% chance of rejecting the biblical God because this guy is, by the way, my dad. 75% of pastors' kids reject God and never come back to believing in him. Okay, so Alex's stats and his thinking are a little dicey at the very least. So just because you have been given evidence through your culture, by no means, does that mean you are more likely to accept this God and have eternal life. Secondly, the teleological argument. Phil was way off as well. I didn't even bring up the teleological argument. Maybe you did. But he's wrong on that as well. I think you got to get to know your partner a little bit better there, Alex. I saw him talking to Richard Dawkins not too long ago briefly. I caught a couple snippets, and oddly enough, it was on the teleological argument and free will. And Dawkins now calls himself a cultural Christian, and he says, I have no idea what to do with the teleological argument because it is so convincing that potentially there is a God. And he said that about free will as well, by the way. So to say that outright the teleological argument is laughable now, to say outright that somehow the universe having a beginning is laughable now, I just don't know who you're talking to. I'm talking to different people, I guess, so we'll have to have another sit down on that one and bring our stats and research. So those are big pieces of evidence. Alex has also said to me before, I just need a revelation and then I'll believe in God. That's all I need, just a revelation. That sounds exactly like Richard Dawkins. And what does Richard Dawkins say? Well, my revelation changes about every year. So his first one was, well, if the stars align and say, Richard, believe in me, I am God. Then I will believe in God.
Pardon my interruptions. I just want to be sure. Maybe this is the last point, and then we'll kick it back.
This is the last point. So I want to know what kind of revelation Alex wants, and what kind of revelation does he want the boy in Myanmar or wherever else to have in order to believe in God, for this God to be fair and morally be good. Because Richard Dawkins switched, and he said, you know what, actually, I need more than that, because I could be hallucinating in terms of those stars aligning. And I hear that from all the top atheists. Now, maybe Alex is talking about a different form of revelation. I want to be fair to him. But I see the consistency, the moving of the goalposts all the time.
So can I reply to that? First, about the Harvard Med people who had did you say 40%?
Over 40%, yeah. Out of Nature magazine.
Right, Nature. Okay. But did you also read the article in Nature about leading scientists still reject God?
What year?
I can dig it up for you, but what they did was they surveyed scientists, and they also compared it to leading scientists. So these were members of the National Academy of Science. So, for example, what we see in the United States is about 70, I think it's 74% last survey I saw, of the general population believed in God. When you went to scientists, it went down to about 50%, or similar to your 40%. But when you went to senior scientists, members of the National Academy, it went down to 7%. That is an enormous discrepancy between the overall population of the US. An enormous discrepancy. So, now, quite frankly, though, it doesn't really matter how many scientists believe in God. This is just an argument. One is a cherry-picking fallacy, because you happen to pick, people in the medical profession, which isn't really a profession. It really isn't a profession that's really relevant to issues regarding God. These would be topics like cosmology, evolutionary biology, things like that, moral philosophy. But if you survey philosophers, and of course, whether God is a philosophical question, they disagree on almost everything. But one thing they actually do agree upon is that God doesn't exist. Something like 70% of professional philosophers do not believe in God, right? So you're basically sort of cherry-picking, Stu. Now, the other topic was the teleological argument. You quoted Dawkins. I think you're misquoting Dawkins, but yet again, it doesn't really matter what Dawkins said. So what Dawkins said was that if an argument was going to convince him, it would be the fine-tuning argument. That doesn't mean he thinks that it does convince him. And he actually criticised the fine-tuning argument on that very program. In fact, Justin Briley, the host, who I know, Alex and I know, we've both been on the show, he even joked. He said, you gave an inch and they took a mile, referring to people like you, Stu, who are misquoting him, right? He's not saying that it is a convincing argument, only that if an argument were to convince him, it would be that one. No, I agree it's the best argument. I think the fine-tuning argument is the best argument for God. That doesn't mean it's a good argument, does it? That just doesn't follow. You can rank bad arguments. Some of them will be less bad than others. But you didn't really answer any of the points that I made about either the beginning of the universe. You said that there was evidence for the beginning of the universe. I'd love to know what that evidence is, because the Big Bang was thought to be the beginning of the universe, but that was based off of Penrose-Hawking theorems. And the Penrose-Hawking theorems have assumptions which are basically widely discounted in the community because it seems all kinds of things. The community don't accept them. Penrose and Hawking themselves don't think that these theorems apply. And, in fact, one of the assumptions is that gravity is always attractive. Well, in 1998, we found that it wasn't. So, basically, physicists have abandoned the idea of the Big Bang as the beginning of the universe. And actually, we have a survey coming out very shortly where that was one thing. We asked controversial topics in physics to physicists, and the thing that they agreed upon the most is that the Big Bang should not be considered as the beginning of the universe. So tell me what evidence you have to back up that claim that you made, that the Big Bang was the beginning of or there's evidence for a beginning of the universe. I don't see it.
Do you want me to go, or am I talking? We're talking too much. Why don't we switch to you guys? Because I could give 10 arguments right now on that. But...
Well, yeah, maybe I can respond to Stuart. You did something which I like to call the genetic fallacy. Of course, it is fallacious to suggest that because you came to a belief through an unreliable method, that belief must be false. That's not quite what I'm saying. Because, of course, in the case of God and belief in God, we're told that there is a God who proactively wants people to come to know him and is in charge of the systems by which people engage with each other and learn about the world. And so, if it is the case that you are, and of course, you said that 75% of people, reject the religions of their parents, that means that there are 25% who don't, and you're just one of those. You may be an exception, but it's an exception that proves the rule, right? And the rule is that you can reliably predict what somebody will believe about God, and therefore, on your worldview, how correct or incorrect they are in their assessment of the nature of the divine, based on where they grow up. And my question, I can't now, of course, that doesn't mean that it's false because they came to it through those methods. But I would say that it's unexpected that God would allow people to go so wrong, so inculpably wrong as well, if in fact he wants to reveal himself equally to everybody. The question I have is, what is more likely? What better explains the reliable geographical spread of religious belief? Is it that there is a God who wants to come to know all equally, but for some reason, nations of people and cultures throughout history unanimously decide on different theologies, and many of them get it wrong, and some of them happen to get it right? That's one explanation. Another explanation is that religion is a byproduct of local mythologies and political and military influence. I think it's at least better explained on that hypothesis. So I wanted to ask specifically on the geographic spread of religious belief. Doesn't prove that religion is false, but do you at least think in isolation that this is better explained on the hypothesis of religion as a sociological project than the hypothesis that there is really a God who exists?
You have to include secularism and atheism then too, if you're going to do that. Like you don't get a free.
Fine.
You don't get a free.
Yeah, absolutely. So you pointed out that most atheists are white men in Western European countries. Okay, but remember that on atheism, on the belief that atheism is the case, that is expected because we believe that religious beliefs are a product of your environment. That would include atheism. That would include secularism. It may be that the reason I'm an atheist is because of the country I was born in, but that does nothing to undermine atheism. It makes me kind of lucky to get the truth if it is in fact true, but it doesn't undermine the truth of atheism to say that I may be an atheist in part because of where I was born, in the same way as it does undermine Christianity to say that you're a Christian because of where you're born and I'm not a Christian because of where I'm born. You see what I mean? You see why I think that's different?
Yeah, I mean, I know that I can see how that follows, but I would ask you, what then is true revelation from God, and what exactly is saving faith then in your interpretation? Because it feels like you're sort of putting that in a box. How do you know it could not be different for different people? How do you know that God knows or doesn't know whether someone will actually accept him before he puts them in a certain locale throughout the world? Why is the Christian faith the most malleable worldview, according to black professor, whose religion is it? He wrote Laman Sana, one of the most respected philosophers at Yale, who passed away not too long ago. He said that the Christian faith, the average Christian is white female, and the Christian faith is not bound, it seems, by a social construct. And the genetic fallacy breaks down, he would say, largely because you see in Africa, 0 to 40%, you see the hub of Christianity move from places like Palestine over to places like Europe, then the U.S., now China, Africa, South Korea. I mean, atheism doesn't do that. So which is a social construct more likely? And I would say atheism.
I think all of it is socially constructed or socially dependent, all of it, including atheism. But that's not a problem. Like, for me to say, you just said that Christianity is the most malleable world religion. Might that not do something to explain its success? The fact that it is just so malleable. Maybe that's why it's so easily spread, because Christianity can adapt and change into the societies that it enters, oftentimes through military conquest. If that's the case, if that is indeed the case, then like what is being undermined about my position here? I believe that religion is a sociological phenomenon that naturally evolves, and the ones which evolve better to the societies that they land in are more likely to survive. That's essentially what you're telling me, and that is completely in accordance with everything that an atheist believes. But as a Christian, you need to believe that this is being guided ultimately by God, by the Holy Spirit, by whatever. This is being guided and supervised. And then you have to explain why it is that the Thai are orders of magnitude less likely to accept Christ than New Englanders. I mean, well, why do you think that's the case?
How do you know that? And what is
the statistics?
What is acceptance? What is acceptance? Like, I don't want to be a universalist here.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
What to you is acceptance, revelation, and the correct theology? Like, sure, I'm buying into what all that you're talking about. Yeah, that makes sense potentially, but I still want to hear from you. It sounds like you have a very tight, nice definition of what saving faith really is, what that looks like.
Well, I don't, because I'm not a Christian, of course. If universalism is true, then this problem goes away. If it's the case that to be saved isn't to be a nominally Christian, it's to just say, do the will of the Father, you might find that more people in Thailand are doing the will of the Father than people in New England are. That would also get rid of the problem. But if you believe that there is any doctrinal necessity in Christianity, if there are particular things you need to believe in, like you need to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, it's not just that he resurrected, but that you believe he resurrected and choose to throw yourself on that. If there's any doctrinal element whatsoever, then we know that societies worldwide vary in their ascension, in their assenting to these propositions, statistically reliably based on where they come from. And that to me is a mystery. But I totally agree with you that if a universalist is listening to this is completely uninteresting, because what does it matter? Everyone's going to get saved anyway. I don't know if you're a universalist. Perhaps you are. But the hypothetical nature of your question makes me suspect that you are, in fact, not.
Well, if you roll out Hebrews chapter 11, Romans 1, Romans 2, then you're spot on. But you have to read those passages. I mean, the patriarchs are going to be saved. They didn't know anything about the resurrection. Nothing. I don't even think they expected that. There was some type of messianic figure, perhaps, that they expected. You have out of, obviously, Isaiah 53 and 61. But then in Romans 1 and 2, this boy in Myanmar who's never going to have the same type of exposure to the gospel as me, how do you know that he's not more like the patriarchs? And his faith is not greater than mine, like you had said. So, no, I wouldn't land on, hey, I have to have all the evidence correctly given to me from the Bible and from the Passion narratives if I'm going to be saved. That's still, it's tightening the noose too much for me.
Do you think that people who've heard of Christ and know a thing or two about him, but proactively deny that he was crucified, just say, I know who Christ is, I know that there's all this evidence of, I don't think he was crucified, I don't think he was God. Do you think those people are saved?
All right, Cliff's about to jump out of his skin here over here, so I better let him roll.
It's an honor talking with you two gentlemen. I'm a little shocked that I heard that Genesis teaches that there's a steel dome over the universe, over the earth. That is embarrassing. I have read the Bible many, many times over the past 60 years. I can promise you there is no science anywhere in the Bible. Science is the discussion of process, how an organism works. There is absolutely no biology, no chemistry, no physics, no geology, no astronomy anywhere in the Bible. And if someone insists that there is, I think that they have an incredibly wooden interpretation of a book, and that's scary. Secondly, there are problems in the New Testament, there are problems in the Old Testament textually, but I can promise you, it is totally plausible for two thieves nailed to crosses on either side of Christ to heap insults on him, and then for one of them to have a change of heart, a change of mind. There's absolutely no contradiction. There are different perspectives, yes. There's a difference, especially when it comes to the dating of exactly when the Passover occurred, and that's because there's a difference between the interpretation of dating in Galilee versus that in Judea. And it's a well-known fact that they disagreed. They had different interpretations. So to be all psyched out about different interpretations of exactly when the Passover occurred, I'm afraid is a hyper-skepticism that if you applied that to all of reality would lead you to be a very lonely, very isolated person. So I'm very unimpressed. I'm also very unimpressed because it's very easy to sit back and take pot shots at different people, a different philosophy, a different religion. But tonight, you put your head on your pillow, and I put my head on my pillow. And like it or not, you're going to have a worldview. I'm going to have a worldview. And Jesus Christ, I've said, is by far the most reasonable, credible, plausible explanation of who God is, of how we are to live our life, the whole dilemma of evil in this world, combined with tremendous goodness. And to listen to some people, I won't name names, but to listen to some people use the moral argument to object to animals being hurt in this life, and to prey upon people's emotional appreciation of animal life, and then to try and use a moral argument that therefore there is no God, that is absolutely ludicrous. Because if there is no God, morality is relative. So what's wrong with animals dying? And obviously the Bible never says that animals suffer because of human sin. Never once does the Bible say that. Instead, we read that there was a rebellion against God, that the angel Lucifer led. There was also rebellion against God in Adam and Eve. So to come down once again so precisely on these points and act like the Bible says this and the Bible teaches that, I begin to think, good gracious, what Bible have you been reading? What are your means of interpreting a text? And if you're going to be overly wooden, it's just as ridiculous to say, well, when Jesus says, I am the vine, he's claiming to be a plant. You've got to allow an author and a speaker to use metaphor, simile, allegory. And these arguments are really hyper-skepticism that's straining at a gnat and missing the whole point. And I think
what is it that we
I just listed them.
Okay, I just want to interrupt here because the idea of the firmament as a solid dome is well established. I mean, even St. Augustine, let me quote you.
So what?
He said, hang on, let me finish, Cliff. Let me just read the quote.
He's not the Bible. St. Augustine
I know.
Well, I'm seeing arguments. hot shots at each okay? I'm listening to arguments and then responding. Please do the same.
We'll listen the same. We'll give about maybe 2 minutes to Phil, and I promise we'll come right back.
Okay. So there's good reasons to think that the ancient people believed that the sky was solid. All right?
Yes.
The quote from Augustine, I'll read it anyway, I know you don't care, but he said, "Bear in mind, the term the firmament does not compel us to imagine a stationary heaven. We may understand this name is given to indicate not that it is motionless, but that it is solid, and it constitutes an impassable boundary between the waters above and the waters below." Now, this is found in Sumerian culture as well. They had a solid dome separating waters. The Bible, in other places, says that it separates the water, so it's doing something. This is, I do accept that there can be poetry in the Bible. I'm not saying there can't be, but in this particular case, they actually explain what the firmament does. Right? The rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, debated how thick it was. Right? So this is a very commonly held belief. So I don't think you can just be so dismissive that these people really believed it. Right? So similarly, even the word rakia, it's from the root, which is to beat out a bowl. Right? You can people have interviewed other people in nomadic cultures, and they think the sky is a solid dome. Right? So this is very, very common in all the surrounding cultures, in nomadic people today. It's there in the word itself, the rakia. People translated it as firmament because they thought it was firm. The rabbis thought this. It's there in the text. In Job, he describes it as being hard as a solid piece of metal. So there's very good reasons to believe that they believed it. Now we can ask the question, what is more likely? That they have this completely false description in the Bible, one, because they didn't know any better, it's written by humans, it's an invention of humans, or two, that is coming from the God who knows the complete description of the universe. Now, you said, when it comes to your other point, that science just describes process. That's just wrong, right? Science also gives us an account of origins of things. It describes the nature of the universe. Cosmology is the science that studies the origins, the content, and the fate of the universe. Now, astronomy also describes what the heavenly bodies are. So the fact that it says there's a firmament is a scientific statement. The fact that it says that there was a global flood is a geological statement. And if you speak to geologists, they'll tell you there was no global flood. So you can't say this Bible doesn't have any science in it. It describes the nature of the universe, the history of humanity, the history of the earth, and it just gets it wrong. So the question is, why does it get it wrong? What's the best explanation for that? The most simplest explanation is that the God of the Bible is fictitious.
I think that is scarily intellectually dishonest. There's absolutely no description of the process that God used to create. And just because Galileo contradicted the accepted Roman Catholic understanding that the Earth was the center of the solar system tells you nothing about what the Bible says. It was a contradiction of how the Catholic Church interpreted the Bible and how Galileo did good science. And Galileo did a tremendous job in science and in interpreting the Bible. Galileo said, the Bible does not tell us how the heavens go. The Bible does tell us how to go to heaven. And you are mixing areas of knowledge. Science is not in the Bible. And just because Sumerian and Babylonian cultures believed in a steel dome, and just because a lot of the Jewish rabbis believed in a steel dome, does not mean that the Bible is teaching that there is a steel dome over the earth. That is so dishonest, it's scary. That is...
It's not steel. The point is that it says so. I agree. The fact...
No, it doesn't say that.
It does. It absolutely...
Show me where it says that. It is not saying that. That is your interpretation, and it's a false interpretation. It's adding where the text is silent, and that's intellectually dishonest. If I read the Quran and I add to the Quran, that's intellectually dishonest. I need to study the Quran and quote the Quran. But if I'm going to add to the Quran and then take a pot shot at Islam because of my addition to the Quran, that is so intellectually dishonest, it's scary.
That's a good question. Firstly, I think even if Phil is wrong here, I would not hasten to charge him with dishonesty. I think that he believes what he's saying to a T. You would just
say about him choosing to be dishonest. The thinking is honest.
You were just talking about adding something to the Quran. I have, I guess, two questions that I want to ask you, Cliffe. The first is this: do you agree with the scholarly consensus of biblical scholarship, that is, that both the long ending of the Gospel of Mark and also the story of the adulterous woman in John's Gospel were added later than the earliest manuscripts, were later interpolations of the text?
Due to the precise nature of the manuscript evidence from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is serious question whether the end of Mark chapter 16 was an addition or whether it was part of the original writing. The same is true for John chapter 7, the end of 7, and the first 11 verses of John 8. There is serious question due to the fact those passages are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, whether those additions or not. Now, Alex, please answer the question. What is more reasonable than the God of the New Testament? Who or what do you put your faith in that is based on more evidence of reliability?
We're getting to this point of reliability because I don't want to just change the subject here. You didn't answer my question.
Alex, you asked a lot of questions. Now, could you please?
But you didn't answer my question. Do you believe that they were later additions or not?
I don't know, but there's solid evidence that those were possibly additions. I don't know.
Okay. In which case, because we have to follow the thread of the argument here, otherwise it's a useless endeavor. If we have good evidence to suggest that people were adding stories into the gospel manuscripts even after they were first published, do we not have good reason to therefore think that people could also add stories to these manuscripts before they were written? In other words, there are all kinds of things that end up in the gospel manuscripts that did not actually happen, weren't in the earliest traditions.
Historically, that would make zero sense, because the earliest church and how close the events themselves were reported through oral eyewitness testimony, not oral tradition. It was spread throughout the entire universal church and was being preached not just by pastors who were looking for nickels and noses, it was preached by the common people. And so to say that there were early editions is such a leap of faith. It's scary just because potentially there was later editions. I don't think that follows.
Maybe Jesus was just a cosmic hoax. It's possible. It's possible. But the question is not what is ultimately possible. The question is, what does the evidence point to as most reasonable, most reliable in light of the evidence that we do have?
That's right. Do you think that outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles and the prophets of the Old Testament rose from the dead themselves, do you think that Jesus is the only person who's ever risen from the dead?
No, Jesus raised people from the dead.
Outside of the people that Jesus rose from the dead and the apostles and the Old Testament prophets rose from the dead.
It's possible that there is some type of near-death experience or some type
I mean, like bodily resurrection.
I am not intelligent enough to follow all of the claims, but the resurrection of Christ, I think, is historically validated in a very intellectually satisfying manner.
So here's a question. In Matthew chapter 27, we're told that there's an earthquake, the second earthquake of Matthew, neither of which we have any other reports of, but there's an earthquake, and the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem exit their graves and walk around the city of Jerusalem, appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
Yes, I do think that happened. Now, Alex, it's time for you to answer my question. What is the alternative to the biblical God, Jesus Christ, that you accept as more reliable? And secondly, what's the evidence that that alternative to Christ is really reliable?
I'm an agnostic. I don't submit to know what the ultimate answers to human existence are, but I don't think that the evidence for Christianity being the correct one is plausible.
So give me the more plausible one. That was my question, Alex. What's the more plausible one that you have chosen to follow? Because obviously you're dressed a certain way. Obviously you have your hair on your face manicured very nicely. So obviously you have motives, you have ambitions. Mm-hmm. So you're living for something or someone. What is it, and what's the evidence that what you are living for is reliable?
I'm afraid I kind of just rejected the grammar of the question. I don't have a systematized theology because I don't even believe in the existence of God. I'm an agnostic, like I say. I don't know the answer to these questions. I don't know what my ultimate motivations are. I don't even have access to my own sort of deepest psychology, so I couldn't tell you why it is that I shaved my mustache and regrew a beard. I don't know, but I know that it's not because of a man who I don't even believe claimed to be God in the first place, allegedly dying on a cross and leaving some scanty evidence behind him.
I don't think that's fair. You are far too articulate. You are far too deep a thinker to convince me that there's not something that's powerfully motivating you. You're living for something, for someone, for some worldview, some philosophies, religion, whatever. Come on, sir. You are not just an accident. You didn't just arrive where you are now by chance. You know that as well as I do.
I don't know that. I mean, that's the question. That's precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to discuss here. I don't know how many times I can tell you I'm an agnostic. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how the universe began. I don't know if there's a God. What I do know is that the textual evidence for things like the resurrection in the New Testament is simply not enough to convince me. For example...
But is it enough to convince you that whatever you're living for is true?
I don't know. But for example, the reason I brought up the raising of the dead in Matthew chapter 27 is because this is an argument from silence, but some arguments from silence work. And if you'll allow me to finish this point, do you agree that the most extraordinary event in human history was recorded in the Gospel of Matthew? That is that numerous people rose from the dead, walked around the city of Jerusalem, and were seen by many witnesses. That's what we're told. Interestingly, the text is a little unclear, because it says that at the time of Jesus' death, the graves opened, and then they appeared to people after the resurrection, implying that there's this 3-day period where they're either laying around in empty graves or hidden somehow. It seems like a bit of a confused text. Now, again, one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some reason they were, I guess, like maybe still dead in their graves for 3 days and then they got up or something, and that this is, although, like I say, the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in the history of our species, and seen by many people, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew in one passing sentence, but it's not mentioned in Mark or Luke or John. It's not mentioned in Josephus. It's not mentioned in Acts. It's not mentioned in any other historical source. People will say this is an argument from silence. Somebody said to me recently, we don't have any written sources of the destruction of Pompeii either. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sure, but imagine that we had numerous sources writing about the city of Pompeii at the time that it was destroyed by a volcanic eruption that didn't mention the volcano. They were writing about Pompeii at the time it's supposed to have happened, and they don't mention the eruption. That would be incredibly strange and suspect. They make me think that we couldn't trust our source. So one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some inexplicable reason, it is just complete radio silence on all of our historical sources. Or it didn't happen and was an invention of Matthew in order to do something like fulfill the prophecy of the apocalyptic Jesus that soon there would be a general resurrection of the dead. Why is it that when Jesus dies, the graves open, but it's not until after the resurrection that they start appearing to people? Is it because Jesus is supposed to be the firstborn of the dead? Is he supposed to be the first one that's resurrected? I don't know. But like you, Cliffe, I'm asking what is the most plausible historical explanation here? And I just don't think that this event happened in the way that you think it did. And if it did, it's a complete and utter mystery why these other sources do not even get a whisper of it.
Just on the question of
God, there is absolutely no problem with resurrection. If there's no supernatural God, then obviously resurrection doesn't happen. But Alex, I cannot accept the way you weaseled out of my question about what are you living for and what's the evidence that what you are living for is true. Agnosticism is an option when it comes to do I prefer spaghetti or pasta? Do I prefer beans or broccoli? I'm agnostic, okay? But when it comes to the ethical decisions that you have to make every day, when it comes to, is human life valuable, and if so, why? When it comes to, is there a meaning and purpose to life, or is there not? And when it comes to, is there life after death or not? You have to go to funerals, Alex and Phil, so do I. People die. You're going to die, I'm going to die. And you have to ask the question, is there a life after death or not? You can't just say, I'm agnostic, I don't know. You've got to figure out, is despair a logical conclusion, or is there some reason for hope? You cannot be agnostic when it comes to, is human life valuable? Is there a meaning to life? What's the ethical system I'm going to embrace? And when I sit at a funeral, is there any hope of seeing this person again one day, or is there not? You are forced to deal with those questions. And to sit back and say, I'm agnostic about whether I pay my taxes or not, I'm agnostic whether I'm going to support equal housing opportunity or not, is a cop-out. You can't live your life that way. It's impossible. That is the impossibility of agnosticism, and that's why, Alex, I don't think you've honestly answered my question.
So can I just interrupt for a second?
I do want to give you a chance to respond, Alex, and I also know that I want to keep track and mention that. Phil, I know you were wanting to make a point, so I do want to give Alex a quick chance to give a pithy reply, and then we'll go over to you, Phil, before we go back over to Cliffe and Stuart.
It'll take a minute, because I think we can try to wrap this business up. I don't know why Cliffe seems to be under the impression that agnosticism is literally impossible, not just irrational, but impossible. But when it comes to ethical decision, for example, it's well known that amongst my followers that I'm an ethical emotivist. I'm not attached to that position particularly strongly, but it seems to make sense of the way that I interact with the world and the way that I see people doing ethics. I think that ethical propositions are expressions of emotion, and that's kind of the end of it. Now, I could be wrong about that. You might think that that has disastrous societal consequences, but to imply that it's impossible to adopt that position, to imply that it's impossible to say, I don't know if there is a God or not, I just think is unintelligible, because I do it, lots of people do it. It's not just that you're claiming that it's irrational, but that it's impossible. You say I'm forced to make, I'm forced to, of course I have motivations for my actions. You know, when I do X or Y, especially when it's a so-called moral decision, of course I have a motivation, but as an ethical emotivist, I believe that I'm just expressing an emotional state, and that is perhaps a pessimistic conclusion, but that's not to say a false one.
I do want to give you a chance, Phil, and then maybe at the end of your response, Phil, if you were able to redirect us back to, does the biblical God exist per se?
Right. Exactly. This is the topic for our debate. The topic for our debate is not what is the best way to live your life. It could well be the biblical God doesn't exist, but some other God exists. Who knows? It could be deism is true. Maybe James had got it right. That is not the topic for our debate. The topic for our debate is, does the biblical God exist? And I think we provided very good reasons to say that he does not. And I don't think you've addressed, for example, the cruelty to animals in the Bible, in nature. You haven't really given a good... Let's just take a specific example, right? In Deuteronomy, we are told that if a town goes around and says, worship another god, you are to kill all of them, including their animals. Now, what justifies that? That's question number one. Now, I want to make a point. Number two, question for Stu. You asked me for the reference about nature, and I found it. Here it is. Leading scientists still reject God. It's 1998, and the paper says, the question of religious belief amongst US scientists has been debated since early in the century. Our latest survey finds that amongst the top natural scientists, disbelief is greater than ever, almost total. Now, if the evidence that you had, that the medics in Harvard had a 40% belief in God, if that was a reason, you actually gave that as one of your reasons in your opening statement to believe in God, wouldn't this be a reason not to, right?
Bro, are you kidding me? You keep misquoting me, like, throughout this debate. Jan's comment, I did not give that in my opening. That was a response. The second response would have been that your idea of atheists coming up with science, check out modern science. Alex himself will tell you who started modern science behind the Galileos, the Kepler's.
No. It was the Greeks.
All of your fallacious. Like, you kept telling me that I was going by certain arguments. You've been misquoting me literally all day. Now, maybe you were quoting Cliffe and just got us mixed up. But now that you're going here as well...
Stuart, did you or did you not quote the Harvard medics? Yes or no?
In a response to you.
Okay. Whether it's a response or an opening, doesn't matter.
That's great.
You did quote
great.
it, right?
Like, you went and found your little statistic and you researched it during a debate. I'll go research it and I'll send it, my article as well, to you on email.
Okay.
It doesn't prove a point.
Okay. No, I agree. Okay.
It's the only reason why I'm a little ticked off.
I don't think it's a
You keep quoting me and you keep talking about points that I did not make.
You did make the point about the Harvard medics.
That was secondary. It was secondary. That was not my opening.
Okay, I accept it wasn't in the opening, but I don't think that's relevant. You made the point, okay? So, let's go back to Deuteronomy then, okay? Well, how is it justified to kill the animals of people that say we shouldn't worship God? Tell me what the justification for that is.
Yeah, sure. Alex said the Bible doesn't talk about animals in heaven. Well, clearly it states that the lion will lay down with the lamb in heaven. So, who's to say when ultimately animals are swept up, for example, in a bomb in Iraq? I'm sure some squirrels have been swept up in a bomb. Who's to say that that's not justifiable in any type of way? When we live in a tremendously broken world, you talked about it yourself earlier, over 90% of the suffering we go through is done by humans. So, no, I'm not going to give you I don't want to say that I don't have a problem with it. Sure, there's some moral imagine that the most reluctant atheist across the pond where you guys live, named C.S. Lewis, he had the opposite response as you do right now. He talks about animal as well as human suffering, and his moral outrage towards it shows that there is a moral law, that there is justice ultimately that's objective, and that would be from God. Then secondly, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, the great Pulitzer Prize winning author over here, Annie Dillard. Read it yourself. She came to believe in God and then a Christian as well as this huge atheist because of her moral outrage over what she saw mainly with insects in the swamp behind her house that she studied for over a year. When she saw different forms of insects landing on the backs of frogs and slowly sucking their brains out, she didn't have this response that you and Alex did, which is, oh, there could be no God who would allow something like that to happen. No, she had the opposite response. And she said, my moral outrage leads me to believing that there is moral objectivity out there. I have a real issue with it. If there wasn't, I wouldn't have a big issue with it. It's just this is how nature operates, and I got to be okay with that. So
These animals.
some of the biggest atheists have come, and I follow what they're saying. That makes sense to me. Checks out.
These animals are not swept up like you described with those squirrels. These animals are killed on the command of God. And as you know, we discussed this at some length in our last conversation in 1 Samuel 15. The best of the livestock are kept alive by Saul. And when he approaches Samuel, Samuel informs him that God has said he regretted he made Saul king. Why did God regret that he made Saul king? Because he kept alive the animals that he was supposed to kill. This is not like there is some kind of natural order which requires a balanced ecosystem which will involve predation and this kind of thing. This is God saying, go into this town, kill the men, kill the women, kill the children and the infants, and kill the animals. And when Saul does not kill the animals and leaves some of them alive, God regrets that he made Saul king. Phil's question, I think, is to explain how this kind of command can be justified. Not animals getting swept up as a foreseen but unintended consequence of the natural order or war, but no, go and kill them. And if you don't kill them all, you're going to be punished for it. Why?
Because you have an omniscient, omnipotent God who controls the entire universe, who we have to allow to judge when he so chooses. And
Judge the animals?
In our 21st century mindset, especially you being very white male and me being very white male, in a very secular, very prominent intellectual area of the world, we're going to have a revulsion to it. Now, I'm going to go to your earlier argument, Alex. Go over.
Do you think it's a white male thing to object to the killing of animals?
They're going to say, who are you, Alex, to say in your white Western culture that there's such a big issue with that? The majority of people in those areas of the world would say, of course a God who's big enough, who created you, is allowed to judge in a nasty, brutish, ancient Near Eastern culture. What's the big deal? And so this gets back to the malleability of the Bible, how it lifts up some cultures and then at the same time challenges and convicts other cultures, rather than this just consensus, universalistic, fluffy type of text.
Let me hang on. I just want to ask you a question. Very simple question, right? If torturing animals is not something to make you think maybe the character in the Bible is not the perfect God that you think exists, right? Because it could be there is a perfect God, but it's not the God of the Bible, right? That's possible. Do you concede that?
Anything's possible. If I'm agnostic. Yeah.
All right. So, right now, if torturing animals is not going to convince you that this God is not perfectly good, if commanding genocide is not going to convince you that this God isn't perfectly good, what would? Tell me what would convince you, actually, the character in this book isn't perfectly good. What would convince you of that?
If he was perfectly good, that he is perfect.
What would convince you that he isn't?
Oh, that he isn't?
Yes.
I would start with the resurrection. I wouldn't go to talking snakes. I wouldn't go to a dome. I would go right to the resurrection, see if Christ really rose from the dead, and then see what he said about the Old Testament and the claims of God. So, no, I don't know exactly. I would wind up like Alex on this one and say, I think if God destroyed the entire human race and kept the human race dead and there were no human beings out there, well, then we wouldn't know, obviously, if he was so good or bad. But the issue, yet again,
if you did that,
again, you are being dishonest. You just said that God tortures animals. No, God stopped the torturing of human beings. Look at Moab, for example, and what was going on with child sacrifice. So he would be considered way better, way more good than what you are stating right here. So there's no torturing of animals.
What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? What happened in the flood? Did they drown over 40 days and nights? Yes or no?
We don't know exactly.
You don't believe in the Bible?
I have no idea what that torturing supposedly looked like, or if it was a swift death.
Hold on, why
Like
are you
with
allowed to
children,
say you don't know?
I don't know exactly what that looked like, that type of justice. But to say that somehow people were holding little puppies in their hands and slowly killing them, I think that's a pretty weak argument.
Who said that? Who said that? Nobody said that. And also,
Bill just said torturing. He used the word torturing.
That doesn't lie.
No, hang on. The flood is happening over 40 days and nights. Now, in law, waterboarding, where you simulate drowning, is considered a torture. Now this is actual drowning. Done over 40 days and nights. Let's think about this. The weak would die first. The little kittens would die before the adult cats, right? This would be a slow death. It's over 40 days and nights, Stu. Now also consider this, right? In Joshua, what does God command of the Hebrew armies? He tells them to hough their horses. Do you know what houging a horse is?
What, that's a good question. We are horse people, but you may know more about horses than me.
Okay, to hough a horse, I had to look this up when I read it, is to sever the Achilles tendon of a horse so that it can no longer run, can no longer walk. It's going to die a horrible death. And that is what God commands the Hebrew armies to do. And it's obviously why, we know why, because it's for victory in battle. Now, God could have easily taught them how to use tranquilizers. He could have teleported the horses elsewhere. He could have just put them to sleep for a few hours during the battle. But no, he commanded this torture, right? Now, if that doesn't convince you that this God is not perfectly good, what would?
Well, I just continue to rely on my favorite intellects over there where you guys are. And C.S. Lewis would answer, yes, there's a problem emotionally for me when it comes to this issue, but there's a greater problem for the atheist and agnostic in explaining this type of moral outrage they have over this issue. So we both have problems. I'm not going to say, oh, this is an easy one. I'm not going to say this is let's just turn it into a page turner. No, there's true issues here, but I defer to C.S. Lewis, and I think Alex should as well, when saying that you still have a bigger issue than me in answering this question when it comes down to where is this ultimate moral outrage coming from? It's just your own subjective opinion.
I would like to
so
know...
why try and convince me of this with your great moral outrage?
I'm not trying to convince you as a point of morality. I'm trying to convince you of a point of the truth of Christian doctrine. I'm making a criticism similar to what Lincoln said of slavery. If this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that it's immoral. I haven't used moralized terms. What I'm saying is that it's unexpected on the command of a loving God. C.S. Lewis, of course, has a chapter in The Problem of Pain where he discusses the suffering of animals. You know how he solves the problem? He says that they don't really experience pain. He says that they're in pain, but they don't realize it. This, to me, is literally a nonsensical statement. I think that actually doesn't make sense. If you want to take that line, if you want to say, well, that's the first C.S. Lewis, look at what he says on the suffering of animals, and ask yourself if you'd be okay torturing a dog, because ultimately, although they look like they're in pain, they're not really experiencing it in the way that a human is. Also, be careful with your quotes. I mean, earlier, Stuart, you quoted Dostoevsky. You actually quoted one of the characters of Dostoevsky as saying that if God has said everything is permitted. Of course, the first place that this phrase "everything is permitted" actually occurs is in Crime and Punishment, but in this place, it's applied to the extraordinary men, in particular Napoleon, who are willing to sort of step over the moral feeling that most people have because they've given themselves a position of authority that absolves them of the general morality to commit all kinds of criminality, even though it kind of runs against people's intuitions. People like Napoleon, these great figures, are able to step over that, as Dostoevsky or Raskolnikov says. And for those people, everything is permitted. That sounds a lot more like the kind of thing that the Israelites were doing than anything that any atheist has done. Also, Dostoevsky wrote in a letter to one of his friends, and I quote, "If anyone could prove to me that Christ is outside the truth, and the truth really did exclude Christ, I should prefer to stay with Christ and not with the truth." So I agree with you that there are a great many literary greats who have assented to Christianity, but some of them do so on such ludicrous notions as diminishing the idea that animals can feel pain in the way that other human beings can, and others do so explicitly saying that they would do so even if the facts were all against them. I also want to know why it is when I'm asked about the most fundamental, basic question of reality, whether there's a God and what the ultimate meaning of life is, that when I say I don't know, you say that that's an impossible question, that I'm not allowed to have that option available to me. But when we ask you a very direct, simple, textual question, do you think this actually happened and why? You're allowed to say you don't know on that much more simple question.
Oh, I don't. Much of the Old Testament, we went over this. Much of the Old Testament you have to leave room for. Is it historical narrative, like William Lane Craig says, picking up in chapter 11 of Genesis? Or is that more metaphorical? Is that more literal? Is there poetry in Psalms, for example? You have Deborah talking about the stars are coming to fight for the Israelites. Obviously, that's a song, because the next chapter afterwards, chapter 4 and 5, you have clearly that they actually fought themselves, so there was metaphor. So no, I'm not going to take any passage in the Old Testament, and especially in the New Testament even, out of Matthew, one single passage. I think it's greater evidence for reliability in one sense if many were silent on it. I'm not going to build a whole theological position off of one verse or one passage. I'm going to take many together. The Old Testament God left room for 400 years for certain people groups to turn, to change, to show love and humanitarian rights. He welcomed slave girls, prostitutes. He welcomed Canaanites into the kingdom. I mean, look at Rahab, for example, another Gentile prostitute. The type of grace and love, I went over this a few last time we talked about, Genesis chapter 12, right out of the gate. He's the one who walks through the dead pieces of animals rather than saying, Abraham, you have to do it, because judgment, talking already about in Genesis 11, is going to land on God. That is the best form of sacrifice and love I could ever imagine.
A lot of bold claims from both sides. I mean, Alex and Phil did really attack the morality of the God of the Bible and why he commits genocide on animals and, at squirrels in the Middle East with bombs and whatnot. But I really do believe, and I stand with Cliffe and Stuart, that essentially what C.S. Lewis says in his book, that the atheists have a larger problem. The atheists have the issue of why you feel this way. Why do you care so much about the genocide? Why do you think that is evil, and where do you get evil from? If you can differentiate between good and evil, and you have a definition of what good and evil are, which are not subjective, are rather objective, then you have to believe in a God. You have to at least be some sort of theist, because you're stealing from a theistic worldview. So for you to say that you have your own definition and you simply come to that conclusion of morality, of good and evil, because of your chemical compounds and because of learned experience from past civilization, well, where is the evidence that past civilization without religion, without God, and without a moral conscience were able to determine what was good, what was evil? Essentially, if we look at it that way, then it's simply a conclusion that we came to in a rather subjective manner, and maybe in the future we can evolve to thinking that good is evil and evil is good. I mean, if it's in that manner, then anything is possible in the future, and we can even end up believing that murder is good. We can even end up believing that wiping out societies and civilizations is a good thing, maybe due to overpopulation on the earth, maybe due to, just significant factors that will play out in the future. And that you would have to be accepted by the atheist community and some agnostics as well. But the Christians who believe that God determines what is good and evil because of the moral conscience that he gives us, then we will always believe that murder is wrong. And yes, we do have occasions in the Bible in which you see the Israelites are commanded to kill. As human beings, will not be able to fully understand why God chose to do that. But it does not necessarily disprove God. It doesn't necessarily disprove a intelligent creator. And you questioning his motives, subjective way of looking at things, well, that can't prove anything. That can't address anything because it's all subjective. It would only make sense if what you believe as an atheist is objective.